Have you ever felt that God was trying to get your attention? It can happen in different ways. Maybe it's like a small, still voice, a whisper, something just very gentle happens in your life. Or maybe it's a little more. Maybe God's tapping you on the shoulder and, hey. And maybe sometimes you just get smacked in the face. I don't know. But sometimes there are things that happen in life that come along that cause us to pause and cause us to reflect and cause us to question and cause us to seek. And those things are not bad things, because sometimes we need to have something divert us from where we're at and what we're doing and what is it that excuse me, God would want with me. There have been times in my life where God wanted my attention, and there were times that I ignored him because I had things to do, places to go, and people to meet. I had my life. And there are other times that he would, get my attention, and I would be willing to listen and to see what he had. And there'd be other times that I was just, maybe God, but let's see how I handle it, and go back and forth. But what's interesting, in all those times, God was the constant. God was the one that was consistently, patiently waiting there. Today I want to look at a guy that God saw something special in, and he had a plan for him. Throughout the Bible, it's interesting to see how that happens. God would come up and tap someone on the shoulder and get their attention, or their life would change. Think about it. There was a little boy out in the field one day, and he was watching the sheep, and someone came and said, "Hey, your dad wants you to come in with the rest of your brothers, and there's someone there that wants to see you." So David leaves his sheep and goes there, and the prophet Samuel comes and says, "Oh, by the way, this is the guy I want to be king over Israel." And his life changed. There was a guy by the name of Caleb. He was an older man, Joshua and Caleb, and he was a military leader. In fact, when it was time to retire, Joshua said, "Hey, I want the mountain country. I want to go conquer some giants." And he did. There were a bunch of fishermen by the name of Peter, James, and John, and God wanted them to leave their nets and to go follow him, and they did. There was a guy named Paul, or formerly called Saul. He was the chief persecutor of the church. He was a guy, when the church first got started, he would go into the homes, drag people out of their homes, take them to prison. He was the one that gave permission for the people to stone to death one of the early deacons of the church by the name of Stephen. He gave his consent. And God encountered him. Jesus met him on the way to Damascus on the road and got his attention, and it changed his life. And the list could go on, but today I want to focus on two people. A guy named Abraham and you. A guy named Abraham and you. Well, why is Abraham such a big deal? He's mentioned almost 300 times in the Bible, 290 times in the Old and the New Testament. That's quite a bit of press. Got a lot of attention. He was such a big deal because he is still known today as the father of the children of Israel, as father of the nation of Israel throughout the Old Testament. There are a lot of different stories about Abraham, of things he did, and we're not going to see all those today. We don't have time, but I encourage you to read from Genesis 12 on in the book of Genesis and find out some of the things he did. So today I want to look at a small part of his story and see how that story changed his life, how the New Testament looked at the life of Abraham, and then how that should impact our lives. So where are we going to begin? We're going to begin at the beginning, where we meet Abraham first off. Genesis chapter 12. This is what it says. The Lord said to Abram. Now, for those of you that notice, he's not Abraham. Well, his name changes later on, and we'll get to that. But he started out being known as Abram. So God came to him and said, the Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." Now, before we break these verses down and talk more about them, I just want you to think about it. Use your creative imagination. Abraham gets this message from God, and then he goes into Sarah, his wife, and they have a conversation. Wouldn't it have been interesting to be a fly on the wall during that conversation? It may have gone something like this. Hey, Sarah, you got a minute? Sure, what's on your mind? Well, we need to start packing. Oh, yeah? Where are we going? Are we going on vacation? Well, we are going to take a trip to a place you've never been before. Oh, how exciting. Where are we going? Well, I really don't know yet. Okay. How can you not know? Well, God kind of came to me and told me to leave our home and our nation and our people and our land. And he said, go to this land which I will show you. But he didn't exactly tell me where that was. Oh, okay. How long will we be gone? Well, probably a really long time. In fact, we may never come back to this place. Okay. Well, why in the world would you do something like this? And maybe Abraham looked at her and said, well, God did mention something that he was going to make me to have a nation, and he's going to give us a land, and a great nation's going to come out of me. And, oh yeah, and something about being a blessing to all the world and all the peoples. Oh, he did he? That's interesting. Well, did you happen to tell him we already have a land to live in? We have a nice place, and that we don't have any children? Have you noticed? How are we going to have a nation? And I have no clue what this blessing thing's all about. Well, he really didn't give me any of those details. But I told him I'd do it. Now, we better start packing and get down to Home Depot and get some packing boxes. Let's go. Can you imagine what that was like? We don't know what happened. We don't know what the conversation is between verse 3 and verse 4. But here's what happened. So Abraham left, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and all his possessions they had accumulated and the people had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Now let me give you a basic introduction to the Bible 101. I had this course when I was a freshman going into Bible college, and all the Bible stories I'd heard, I'd never heard this before, had anyone pointed out to me, so I don't want your life to go on without knowing this, all right? It's okay? But what's interesting is Genesis chapter 12 here is what's known as the Abrahamic covenant. And what that is, a covenant is a promise between God and mankind. And this particular set of verses are so important because it breaks down into three things. God promised them a land. Go to the land I will show you. God promised him a nation. I will make you a great nation. And God promised him a blessing. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And what this does, it forms the basic structure of the rest of the Bible. Because what you find is the promise of a land is found in Genesis through Judges. That's where the children of Israel are growing into a large group of people, and they go in and they receive the land finally in the book of Judges. Joshua and Judges. Then the nation was formed, and that's basically the story from 1 Samuel all the way to the end of the Old Testament. It gives you all the stories that happened, all the kings, all the battles, all the stuff. It gives you the prophets. They came and they told the children of Israel what was going to happen. We have the story of Daniel and all these other things, and it's the story of the nation, how that nation became a nation. And then the blessing, the third part of that promise, is seen in Jesus. Jesus was the blessing that would come through Abraham's lineage, through the descendant of Abraham was ultimately Jesus, and Jesus is the one that became the one who blessed all peoples. So you find this promises in Genesis 12, and it structures really the rest of the biblical story. Other than that, it's insignificant, okay? And God takes this promise in Genesis 12, and he reaffirms it 3 other times in the book of Genesis. That's how important it was. It was a pivotal story for the Bible and God's story. and it can also be pivotal for us. For the New Testament takes the story of Abraham and refers it to in many different times, in many different ways. But how in the world can a story that happened thousands of years in the Mesopotamia area, the top of the Fertile Crescent, which is now southeastern Turkey, how can God take something that happened so many years ago, so far away, and it still make a difference with us? Well, to me, it boils down to two things: obedience and promise. Obedience and promise. So let's look at this idea of obedience first. See, God calls us to obey. God asks us still to obey. He's never stopped asking for obedience. God called Abraham, and on the surface to Abraham, you think about it, there was no plan. He had no idea where the place was, and no provision. And God just says, all right, I want you up and do this. Yet God knew the plan, and God knew the place, and God knew the provision. And what did Abraham do? He simply obeyed. It was up to him to obey. God would take care of everything else. And the Bible doesn't let us in, again, on the mind of Abraham when he was asked to do this. But wouldn't it be interesting, again, use your creative imagination here. What were some questions that Abraham might have had? What are some questions you might have in that situation? Well, you might ask, God, why me? Who am I? I'm not anything special. And at this point, we don't know anything about Abraham, really, in his life. We don't know why he's the one. And I imagine he asked, well, where is it you want me to go? The land of Haran he lived in was a very nice area. The northern part of the Fertile Crescent, it was a nice city, a modern city for that day and age. It was a plush valley. He had everything you could ever want in Haran, and that's where Abraham was living at the time. Lord, how am I going to survive? How am I going to get food? Where's my shelter going to, all these things. We don't know what Abraham did for a living prior to this, but obviously he was 75 years old and he had not starved to death yet. So, he had earned some money somewhere and bought some food and had provision, and yet he's asked to give it all up and take off. I wonder if he questioned that. Gee, where are we going to eat? What are we going to eat? And how are these people going to react if I just move my family in their backyard? How's that going to go? How's that going to work? And the questions could have gone on and on and on. But what happened? Abraham simply obeyed. Verse 4, so Abraham left as the Lord told him to leave. And he took his family and his nephew Lot, and he's part of the story. We're not going to spend any time on him, but we will in a couple weeks in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lot packed up everything, and Abraham and Lot packed up everything and went on the journey, and that journey created the framework for the rest of the story in the Bible. But here's the big deal. Simple obedience can make a big difference. Simple obedience can make a big difference. God called Abraham to follow him. He calls us to follow him. And we say, but Lord, I don't want to follow. I want to lead. I like to be in charge. I like to know where I'm going and what's going to happen. And I like to have everything laid out. I want to be in control. And yet God calls us to obey. I was at a men's conference several years ago, and the speaker gave a message I'd never thought of and I'd never have forgotten. It was on leadership. The conference was about leadership, how to be a leader. And his message was, Jesus never called anyone to lead. All Jesus ever did was ask people to follow. Wow. For you see, if you followed Jesus, then your life would be changed. And your life is changed, then God can use you to do whatever needs to be done. Whether that's leading a group or a person or just leading your own life. So Jesus doesn't call us to lead. Jesus calls us to follow. And when it came to Abraham in the New Testament, he was the guy that they kept referring back to. The Apostle Paul says this in Galatians chapter 3. He says, look, consider Abraham. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Understand those, then, that those who believe are children of Abraham. Take a moment. Consider Abraham. Think of his story. Look at all he did, the places he went, and all the things that happened. Consider him, he says. And then he says the most quoted passage about Abraham in the New Testament, and it was credited to him as righteousness. What was credited to him as righteousness? Well, back in Genesis chapter 17, God comes back to Abraham and he reminds him what he told him and said, remember Abraham, I said I was going to make a great nation of you, and guess what? You're going to have so many descendants, they're going to look like the stars of the heaven, the sands of the seashore. And it's like Abraham raises his hand and says, but God, I don't have a son yet. He said, no problem. Well, in Abraham's mind, it was a problem because he was 99 years old. And his wife was a beautiful young thing of 98 years old. And he reminded God. In fact, it says he fell on his face and laughed. That's how crazy he thought it was. But God had given him a promise. And it says, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, we all know what it is to receive a credit. You know, you might get a credit on your charge card or something like that. And you go, oh, good, I got some extra money. This isn't so much a financial term there. It's to his credit is more how we would use it. Well, to his credit, he believed even though it didn't make sense. Even though he shouldn't have believed. Even though it seemed impossible, Abraham still believed, and it says it was credited to him as righteousness. And God remained faithful because Abraham continued to obey. And it didn't happen overnight. How old was he when he called him in Genesis 12? 75. And how old is he when God comes and says, oh, by the way, I haven't talked to you for a while, you're going to have a kid? He was 99. Now, if my math is right, that's about 24 years. When was the last time you waited 24 years for anything? You know, if I'm in the drive-thru for over 5 minutes, I start to get, shaking. Like, oh, man, what's taking them so long in there? We hate to wait. And yet, Abraham faithfully waited. And a year later, God gave him and Sarai a son, and he was named Isaac. And then from Isaac, he had a son, and his name was Jacob. And then Jacob had 12 sons. And from those 12 sons formed the 12 tribes of Israel. And God's promise starts to take shape of you'll be a nation. What's the point? God called Abraham and he obeyed. And God still calls us today to obey him. Even when it doesn't make sense. Even when we might laugh. God, that makes no sense whatsoever. Even when we don't understand. He consistently throughout the Bible challenges us to obey and follow him. And when we do, I believe God takes care of us. As I was writing this week, I reflected back when we moved down here to Florida. It was about 14 years ago, be 14 years in May. And it didn't, I'll be honest, in some ways it didn't make a lot of sense, but I've been praying, Lord, what do you want us to do? And I get a call one day, and we moved down here, and I'll be honest, there were times I thought, what in the world was I thinking? Left a nice church in Central Illinois in a good situation. Our daughter was in junior high. Judy had a job at the school system, and here we moved down to Florida. And it didn't make sense in some ways. But God had a plan, and God had a provision, and God had a place for us to serve. And here we are. And that's just my story. Maybe you have your own story, or maybe you're still writing your story. But when you're writing that story, and when you think back on your story, you have to ask yourself, was I obeying God? Am I going to obey God? Will I continue to obey God? Because he has the plan, and he has the place, and he has the provision for me in my life. So, never forget, God calls us to obey today and tomorrow and the next day. And when he calls us to obey, he gives us some promises. And God's promises still hold true. God's promises still hold true. All the promises of Abraham were fulfilled. A promised land. Did Abraham get a deed to the land? No, but God kept his promise even though it took a couple generations. And God promised him a nation. Did Abraham become the king of that nation? Did he have a throne and a castle to rule from? No, but God formed a nation. Did Abraham see the blessing of Jesus? Was he alive when that happened? No, but God kept his promise. And that whole concept in the New Testament, when you look back at Abraham, is why he stands out so much. Listen to what Hebrews 11 verses 8 through 16. This is what they say about Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, I love that phrase, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand of the seashore. And then verse 13, it kind of summarizes Abraham and all those who came after him. It says, and all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. They only saw them and welcomed them from the distance. That's what's called walking by faith. That's why it's included in Hebrews 11, the great faith chapter of the Bible. But at the end of this passage, listen to what the people of faith were to receive. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. My challenge to you and my challenge to me today is this: make God proud of you by obeying him so that he says, look, there's one of my kids. They made God proud because they trusted the promises of God. And the promises of God, their belief of those promises was not based on results that they could see or touch or feel or pick up. It was their faith in God and his promises, and that's all they needed. And God still promises, or God's promises still come true today. We need to remember that. Have you heard the phrase, there's an app for that? You know, you ask somebody about, man, I wish they did something like that. Oh, well, there's an app for that, you know. Just look in your store. Well, you need to find help in the struggles that you're facing in life. Well, good news. There's a promise for that. Then Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, or let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. You're dealing with stuff in life, struggles that you have, there's a promise for that. He says, come to me, and you'll find rest. You need to find hope to live day by day in life. There's a promise for that. You don't know where the strength's going to come from. Paul says, and I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. I love that passage. And the emphasis is not on, I can do everything because I've got it figured out, and I've got a plan, and I've got security, and I've got, talents, and I've got skill. It doesn't say any of that, does it? It says, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Last night I was watching the news, and they had this story at the end of one of the national broadcasts about a crossing guard, a lady in California that had been a crossing guard for years and years. And they had her sitting in a chair, and all the kids were surrounding around her. And they were singing songs to her and about her and all this. And at one point, they showed her, she just looks up to heaven and raises up her hand. And what was interesting is the commentator, when he came back on and was interviewing this lady, he said, well, I saw you in the middle of that, raising your hand and looking up. What was that all about? And she said, that was just me thanking God for making me who I was and the privilege I had of doing what I did. And I wondered, would the commentator ask that if he knew how she was going to answer? But she wasn't ashamed, and she realized that who she was because of what God had done in her. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. You need relief from pain and sorrow you're dealing with. There's a promise for that. Revelation 21 says, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, or no more mourning, or no more crying or pain, for the old order of things have passed away. And the next verse goes, and he makes all things new. We deal with death in our lives and family members and all those things. But this promise we won't see here on this earth. There's still going to be tears. There's still going to be pain. There's still going to be crying. But I love to promise that someday that's all going to go away. And that's a blessing. You're wondering if the struggle of Christian living is worth it when it doesn't seem that anybody's giving you many high fives and too many things to get excited about. There's a promise for that. John 14, 1 through 4, it says this, do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would not have told you. And I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. Wow. Wow. God's promises still hold true. And God may not call you to pack up and take out to a foreign land that you've never been to, but he may ask you to simply obey the next step in front of you. And when you do that, he promises, lo, I'm with you always, even to the very end of the age. Let's learn from Abraham. Let's let God get our attention. And the next time he does, let's listen and obey. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this day. I thank you for your word. I thank you for your promises.